Welcome dear friends to the YouTube channel Lit eCity, and in today's special class we are going to discuss a very interesting literary theory which emerged during the 1980s, and it was quite an interesting development into the literary studies, and how literature is read, how its relation with history is understood. It changed all these things. Dear students, we are talking about the new historicism. New historicism, as you can see even in this diagram, it is telling about the process. New historicists जो होते हैं, they seek surprising coincidences. Surprising coincidences का मतलब क्या होता है? They find the related material in other texts, जो literary texts नहीं होते उनमें देखते हैं. Then generic historical cultural lines को वहां से ये सर्च करते हैं, चाहे वो एनेक्डोट्स हो चाहे कुछ और वहां से मेटाफर, पॉपुलर कल्चर, इन सब को लेते हुए एक बड़ी ही पाथ ब्रेकिंग, एक बड़ी ही रेडिकल रीडिंग करते हैं उन टेक्स्ट की जिनको आज तक बिल्कुल अलग ढंग से पढ़ा गया था. सो इन दिस लेसन वी आर गोइंग टू अंडरस्टैंड विद सम help of some graphs, with the help of some examples, all those important things that makes new historicism an important part of our preparation. Okay, first thing first, background ki, if we talk about the background, first of all, new historicism, it is a bit different from other literary theories of post-war period. In fact, we can call it post-structuralist theory. ये part है post-structuralism का, जैसे deconstruction है, जैसे later Marxism या Marxist theory है, psychoanalysis है, post-colonialism है. Similarly, new historicism is a development which was inspired by those very same ideas which inspired other post-structuralist theories. But it is more than a theory, it is a style of literary analysis. This is important. It is more than theory. It is not a theory. It is basically a style of literary analysis developed mainly in the United States from 1980s onwards. And its main purpose was to challenge the dominance of deconstruction and the legacy of new criticism. What हम इससे क्या समझ सकते हैं? Dominance of deconstruction means जो उस समय at the time deconstruction was the main academic force in literary theory, and there was also outdated legacy of new criticism. इन दोनों का जो फोकस है, दे फोकस ऑन द टेक्स्ट इटसेल्फ, हालांकि बिल्कुल अपोजिट है उनका. वो हम वी विल सी लेटर इन दिस लेसन. And its basic purpose is to produce a cultural poetics. Please remember this term, cultural poetics. It is a very important term, cultural poetics. In fact, Stephen Greenblatt, जिसको की फिगर माना जाता है न्यू हिस्टोरिसिज्म में, he gave this term, he preferred this term instead of new historicism, and reinforcing a historical dimension to literary studies. If you remember, जो हम लिटरेचर की स्टडी करते हैं, there are schools, there are basically studies like new criticism which are in favor of completely detaching the literary text from all other kind of text. उनका फोकस केवल एक और केवल उस टेक्स्ट पे होता है. While there are other theories like Marxism जो बहुत ज़्यादा डिपेंड करते हैं other forces, other particular phenomena of that time, especially economics, और उनके हिसाब से literature is basically a superstructure जिसका base जो है economics है. Deconstruction once again pays focus on the text itself, but rather different process from new criticism. लेकिन जो new historicism है, it is basically study of relation between literature and history and other stream, but it is not just another Marxist approach. It adds another new dimension in the relation, reinforces historical dimension to literary studies. Earlier, historicists upheld a belief in the objectivity of the historical past. History was considered to be the accumulation of facts. मेन जो डिफरेंस है हिस्ट्री और फिक्शन में, जो एक तरह की कॉन्ट्रास्टिंग टर्म है, एक तरह की अपोजिंग टर्म्स है, दैट फिक्शन इज बेस्ड ऑन इमेजिनेशन, मैनिपुलेशन ऑफ फैक्ट्स, जबकि जो हिस्ट्री होती है इट इज बेसिकली स्टडी ऑफ फैक्ट्स. But new historicists like Stephen Greenblatt, Louis Montrose, and Stephen Orgel, they rejected this idea of history being a single massive monolith that left no room for dissonant voices. In fact, if you have read about postmodernism, post-structuralist theories, and theories given by Micheal Foucault, you know very well ये जो postmodernist time है, it is basically rejection of all grand narratives, one single monolithic. Monolithic means which has only one shade of color, which is there is no we can say dissonant voice, nothing, no opposition. लेकिन जो न्यू हिस्टोरिसिस्ट हैं या फिर अदर स्ट्रीम्स जो मैंने नाम लिए, दे पीपल try to find out those voices that have been suppressed, that have been faded. Old historicism thus was monological and concerned with discovering stable point of reference. Okay, stable point of reference which can be used once and again and again and again without any, we can say, deviation. If we take an example of the traditional approach, E.M.W. Tilliard, who was a very famous literary critic also, and he analyzed Shakespeare's history plays, and this particular analysis by Tilliard, which was traditional historicism, ye based the two assumptions. First, history is a determinate text and therefore knowable. It means by this statement or by this assumption हम कह सकते हैं that we can consider history as a fixed meaning generating text. हिस्ट्री के अंदर कुछ फिक्स मीनिंग्स हैं एंड दे आर एवर ट्रू, जो हमेशा क्या है, दे आर ऑलवेज ट्रू एंड दे आर इन, they cannot be changed. Second of these assumptions is that literature reflects directly or indirectly historical reality and is therefore better understood with reference to that. Traditional definition of literature is the mirror of society. तो यहाँ पर अगर हम देखें तो literature is a reflection of that historical reality. So obviously, if we know the background, if we understand what happened at that time in that particular society which produced a particular text, then we can easily understand, decode that text. It has been a traditional approach in all the academic analysis of literature. When we read Shakespeare, we read about Elizabethan times and we say how the prosperity of the Elizabethan age basically made it possible for writers like Shakespeare and their plays and sonnets and songs. They are basically reflection of the lives of the Elizabethan period. However, the new historicism, while trying to understand the historical conditions, contends, it basically argues our knowledge of history cannot be objective. Now, this is very important here. It means that even the subject history, which is considered to be study of facts, it cannot be objective. The writer, the situation in which the writer is writing, the knowledge paradigm of that particular period decides what is history. Even more radical than this, about new historicism is that it recognizes a variety of competing centers of cultural power. Competing means this is basically, it has borrowed or inspired from deconstructive theories. It means that there is not one center of power which we generally assume, but there are some other centers also which are always trying to compete to come into the center. तो ये जो struggle है, This struggle always goes on and there is no fixed one rooted center. New historicism try to locate all these dissonanting centers also and how they were suppressed or किस तरह से we can trace them in our literary books. So new historicists are basically against the traditional historians who monologize history, who reduce historical periods to a single homogeneous tradition. Instead, they consider history as a dialogue within the past as well as with the past. So, during our new historicist reading, we are having a dialogue within the past, that is basically traditional history as well as with the past. Present is basically having a dialogue with the past, and past is basically giving information to the present. It refuses the view that only history has a truth claim. This is most important assumption of the new historicism, that both history and fiction are discourses. You may have heard this term, this very important term, discourses. Discourses, this term is basically used by Micheal Foucault again and again to point out how we treat our subjects of knowledge. They are basically human constructs. They are nothing like, we can say, transcendental phenomena, but they are constructed by human beings, signifying systems, and both derive their truth from that identity. So there is nothing like absolute truth. Their truth, even if there is some truth, that truth is totally relative. So if we see a graph, एक ग्राफ से हम इसको समझते हैं. First we look at old historicism. Old historicism, it treatment of history as an objective study of facts, very easy. Okay, then it is monolithic. There is no deviation from it. There is no we can say doubts, or there is nothing like the author or the writer of those facts claim that he or she doesn't have the complete knowledge. More important, whatever is presented in history is considered to be the universal or the spirit of the age. So we try to fix certain formulas for a particular period of time when we study about the ages, Elizabethan age or Restoration age. We put some characteristics that is called spirit of the age. And last, this division, this classical division, history is all about facts and literature is fiction or based on imagination. This is the basic assumptions of old historicism. And in contrast to this, if we talk about new historicism, it says history is also a myth like literature. There is nothing like true knowing of the past. We cannot claim that we understand or we know what actually happened in that particular period. It is just a version by people in power. Indian students, you are very well aware how every time a government changes, the syllabus also changes, and syllabus change, there are changes in history books also, and every time there is a change, there is claim by the other part that history is being maltreated. This shows that history is just a version by people in power, which changes according to the change in power. There are other versions of the same event, but they were suppressed. Even today, we can very well understand this fact. Whenever an incident happens, especially if some foul kind of incident happens, you may find because of a plethora of news channels, there are many versions of that particular incident, and it is very difficult to reach one final, we can say, scientifically truth kind of version. So basically, history is equal to fiction. History is also fiction. So this is complete, we can say, a radical departure from the traditional approach of the old historicism. Now we talk about this particular theoretical approach and its origins. The origin of new historicism can be traced back especially to the Marxist Raymond Williams and his book Marxism and Literature. published in 1977, and it inspired the rehistoricization of literary studies. And second book, it was Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978. It questioned preeminence of Eurocentric cultural discourse. These two books, they basically changed the way we read literature, the way we look at relation between history and literature. Though the term seems to have been coined by Micheal McConnell. Micheal McConnell, he basically first used this term. Actually, it come to prominence Stephen J. Greenblatt's his book Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare in 1980. It was with the publication of this book that New Historicism as an academic discipline came into being. In 1982, the founding of the journal Representations also gave further momentum to the new historicist scholarship. So these three steps you can understand, you can find important while making notes or while remembering this particular approach. Stephen Greenblatt, he was not very much comfortable with this term new historicism, and he called it cultural poetics, and he defines new historicism as in his essay Towards a Poetics of Culture. His methodology is at best a practice rather than a doctrine. This is the major change. There are no set rules, there is no methodology, there is, we can say, there is nothing like we can say particular framework, theoretical framework. It is basically reading of text, finding about those suppressed voices, finding reading history and finding connection between the history and literature. So there is nothing like a doctrine. You can't find any book which says that new historicists follow particular rules or framework. So what I mean to say that rather than a formulated theory, new historicism analyzes text, and this text doesn't mean only we can say literary book. It includes print, filmic, hypertextual, oral and other narrative practices. So the basic practice, the basic strategy used by a new historicist is that it explores the literary as well as the non-literary constructs of a given era in the effort to assess their larger implications and significance. Now, new historicism finds new meanings. What does it mean, new meanings? That it doesn't rely on the old interpretation in literary texts. How? Not by giving new aesthetic interpretation, by analyzing in detail some marginal, these are important words, marginal, non-literary anecdotes or non-literary text from relevant period. This is important. It is, we can say, taking a literary text and taking a non-literary text. It may be some memoir, some letter written by some newspaper article, some anecdote by some eminent personality or even some common person of that time, and trying to locate the common element or the contrasting element, what is considered to be truth and what is contradicted to be truth. All these things are done by these scholars. Actually, new historicism is a byproduct of the ideas developed by Micheal Foucault, especially his ideas regarding relationship between power and knowledge. Now, according to Foucault, what is knowledge? It is not something abstract or absolute. It is determined by certain key institutions in society like church, university, government, political parties, and they also change or bring in other institutions. Knowledge, it is not something we can hallowed entitled. It serves as the source of power, making statements as to what is normal or abnormal, what is valid or invalid, what is true or what is false. It is also significant there are no pure facts in history, because every fact in history is a human construct. All historical narratives reveal a process of selection by those in power that judge some facts relevant and other immaterial. So it is all. What is history? History is not presentation of fact. It is rather selection of facts that are suitable for those that are in power. Here in this diagram you can see power. It established institutions like schools, hospitals, what is taught in schools, how a particular patient is treated, what is considered to be a disease and what is considered to be not to be a disease, prisons, who are put into prison, what punishment is given for what particular offense. It constitutes these institutions constitutes subjects. Then it incites or provoke or produces form of knowledge. How? By educating, by caring for which people are being cared for, especially which people are ignored, for whom shelter homes or facilities are given, who are given preference in treatment, and last, prisons, punishment, how punishment is being meted out, all these things. And this knowledge actualizes or modifies or redistributes or stabilizes power. So it can actually change also, but all those who are in power, they try to stabilize their power through these institutions. So this circle is always basically moving. It is a dynamic circle in which sometimes there is a replacement of power, and once the power is replaced, the whole circle takes a new dimension. Now, Foucault focused on social groups, the insane, prisoners, homosexuals, women oppressed by the modern society, the groups that were not given a free voice in the literature of the time. Similarly, the new historicists, they try to locate the often ignored or portion of a work and expose what was the unsaid, the unheard and the unseen, the marginal or residual through the parallel study of literary and non-literary writings. So, they want to basically double lens. You can use this particular metaphor. It is double lens. Through the double lens, once they basically see through the literary text, and then they see through the non-literary text, and they try to decode what is basically hidden, what is written in between the lines. It is not just deconstructive reading, only focusing on the text or the words or the language. It is about the context also. Here we will understand it more clearly. New historicism versus other post-structuralist approaches. Greenblatt defined new historicism as a shift away from the practices of new criticism and formalism, because these two, they focused on the text only, towards a criticism centered on cultural artifacts. Now we know very well that new criticism, their main focus, and formalism, their main focus was on the form and the formal parts of the text. They basically try to find out one single meaning. So their basically approach is to totally done away with all non-literary elements, whether it is we can say the famous terms which they use, that there should not be about authorial intention. We cannot know the intention of the author, and there should not be any focus on the background. Similarly, new historicism also differs from other post-structuralist approaches. While post-structuralism tries to effect the multiple meanings from a close reading. Now, opposite to the new criticism, post-structuralism, they open up text from many we can say approaches, and they show that not one single meaning is stable. There are a variety of meanings, and texts are basically open-ended. New historicism attempts it more from the cultural context and in which text is embedded. It is basically different from new criticism, because it also, like post-structurally, believe that there is more than one meaning in the text. But it is different from the post-structuralist other approaches like deconstruction, because it says that there may be importance of text, but there is also importance of non-literary elements like history. This particular diagram will give you some idea. New criticism, it is about text. Okay, one single interpretation. Their main aim is to find paradox and tension and all these things, close reading, and they focus on the formal elements of the text. They do not pay any heed to the social or the economic background. On the other hand, we have post-structuralism. Once again, their focus is on the text, but they find multi-interpretations and they say that meaning is undecidable. There cannot be one final. So these two they both have close reading, but they are totally opposite in their approach and findings. In contrast, we have new historicism. It also pays focus on the text, but not only one text. It pays focus on an array of texts, literary and non-literary, and treat them equally. For a new historicist scholar, a text, whether it is history or literary, both can have equal impact on each other. So they reach to the multi-interpretation by finding out its relation with the other text. I hope you understand this basically now through this graph. What is the technique? Now, how does new historicist scholar do their job? Now, new historicist readings involve a parallel reading. This is important, what we have seen in the last slide also. Parallel reading or juxtaposition of the literary and the non-literary texts of the same historical period. Both are given equal importance and allowed to work as source of information or interrogation with each other. Now, literary text can question the history, and the historical text can question the literary one. This way, the non-literary text become not a context, which is generally which we use, a background, but rather a co-text along with the literary work. Here we can see. So, traditional approach, history is considered to be the background and literature is the foreground. To understand literature, we have to look at the context of the history. This is the traditional approach. While in the new historicism, both history and literature, they are co-text. History is equally important as literature, and both are read with the same intention to find out their interrelationship. New historicism operates with the help of what Clifford Geertz points out, thick descriptions. An important term in this context, thick description. We call a description of text would be thick if they are referred to the social and cultural forms in which the text operated. So when we read not only the literary text but also the social meanings, cultural, economics, and when we read all these things together, put together, it becomes a thick description. A typical new historicist essay begins with a historical anecdote, and the use of the historical anecdote can function either as a supplement giving more information or a counter discourse to the existing historical narratives. So, the typical new historical reading of a text follow these steps. First, one should begin with specific details, anecdotes, examples in order to avoid a totalizing version of history. When we read these things, anecdotes and examples, we find that there are certain, we can say, inconsistencies with this particular monolithic approach to history. Then, from this particular reading, we should proceed to illustrate how they are tied up with larger contradictory forces which are generally ignored and in a given time period, no matter how apparently simple the detail may seem at first. It may seem quite innocuous, quite simple, quite we can say which can be ignored, but when we find that it is fine attuned to the larger contradictory forces, तब हमें समझ में आता है कि ये छोटा सा पॉइंट भी it can give basically step to the new interpretation. All cultural products, whether they are high art, political document, personal letters, or even trash, they are part of a larger discursive structures, so can offer clues to the ideological contradiction of a given period. So nothing have to be discarded. Main thing is that everything related to that particular period and text, it should be scrutinized, closely basically inspected. Here it is a very important quotation which Greenblatt basically penned out in his essay, in his book Resonance and Wonder. He says that new historicist critics have tried to understand the intersecting circumstances not as stable, prefabricated background against which literary text can be placed, but very important, but as dense network of evolving and often contradictory social forces. The idea is not to find outside the work of art some rock, that is generally Marxist theory that economics is the rock onto which literary interpretation can be securely chained, but rather to situate the work in relation to other representational practices operative in the culture at a given moment in both in history and our own. So this is how it is different from Marxism also, because in Marxism everything is basically once again homogeneous, controlled by economic forces of the time. But once again Greenblatt points out that the focus of a new historicist is to situate the work in relation to other representational practices. Similarly, Louis Montrose in his essay Professing the Renaissance, he calls it a return to history from the post-structuralist obsession with language and argues that new historicism is concerned with very popular line, the historicity of text and textuality of history. What does he mean by that? The text has its own history because it is embedded in the social and cultural context. So it has its own historicity. Okay, and history has a claim to textuality. History is also a text. History is also like a literary text because we have no access to the full lived authentic past. We can only have guess. We have to basically depend on our sources, and only traces of it are preserved. It is not preserved in complete, in toto. Now let us have some examples which these celebrated critics have used to explain the process. For example, Stephen Greenblatt, he points out how the powerless and oppressed other, we can say the marginal element, they were always marginalized and dehumanized in Renaissance plays. His main focus, his specialization is the this particular period, and correspondingly in society or vice versa. What is basically those who were considered to be dangerous for the decorum of the society, those were also marginalized in the plays. Greenblatt places the Elizabethan plays side by side with the historical factors which pointed to a colonialist policy in the Renaissance. In his book Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare, he brings out the practice of self-fashioning, basically accommodating ourselves according to the cultural environment of the time. People consciously or unconsciously integrate themselves with the accepted standards of the society. Here you can see reading Shakespeare. If it is about old historicism, what will be our focus? A line. A rose is a rose is a rose, and we will think about its literary quality, the tropes used in it, the devices, and how the basically character used it in a particular situation. Our full focus is on the line and its poetic beauty. On the other hand, new historicism, they ask different question. Why rose only? Why not? Why? What other text says? What botany of that time says? How rose become an important symbol about purity or about virginity? What about other flowers? Why Shakespeare didn't write a lotus or lily is a lily is a lily? Is it only for the sake of, we can say, a particular flower? So this is the difference in the approach. This is basically a new historicism raises certain questions which are not related with the literary text only, but which are related with the cultural environment of the time. That is why Greenblatt prefers to call it cultural poetics. One more example, Louis Montrose, his essay A Midsummer Night's Dream and the Shaping Fantasies of Elizabethan Culture, Gender, Power and Form. It is an example of new historicism practice. For example, the opening sentence, and it is basically a fashion of new historicism to open the essay with an example of anecdote. I would like to recount an Elizabethan dream, not Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, but one dreamed by Simon Forman on 23rd January in 1597. And then he goes on pointing out the repressed sexuality and how Shakespeare presented in the forms of metaphor. Another example is by Greenblatt, who mentions an anecdote about Mary Le Marcy, who was a household servant in Rouen, France in 1601, who discloses to her fellow servant Jean-Louis Fabre that she was a man masquerading as a woman. This parallels with the situation of disguised identity we find in many of Shakespearean plays like As You Like It or Twelfth Night. Thus, the play actually presented the subversive practices of the society in rather comic form. Another example is provided in a handbook of critical approaches to literature, in which Suzanne Bruce, in her article The Flying Island and the Female Anatomy, Gynecology and Power in Gulliver's Travel, offers an explanation of why Swift named the flying island Laputa, which in Spanish means the whole. Bruce begins her article by describing a commentary on Gulliver's Travel published in 1727 by one Corolini di Marco, who makes a dry reference to Gulliver catching rabbits for food in book 4, and then goes on once again to explain the sexual mores of the time, the eating habits and use by Swift. One last example we will take of Othello. Traditional point of view, Othello has been a study of jealousy of Iago and incredulous by Othello. New historicist approaches focuses on how a culture produces evil. The culture itself produces evil to handle or to deal with certain historical particulars. Othello shows cultural distancing, how we distance ourselves. Elizabethan England constructed other cultures as a threat in order to create a sense of its own national identity. We all know that Othello was a Moor. He was not a fair Roman British person. So how this is, we can see. If looking from traditional point of view, this picture is about Othello viewing jealousy, manipulation by Iago, innocence of Desdemona, talking about poetic beauty, tragedy of Desdemona, and Othello's prowess, Iago's manipulation. All these things we take into consideration when we do a traditional reading. While when we read according to the new historicism, we read about the concept of race and social order, subversion, and how new thinking which was taking place at that time, how it impacted the social order of that time. So this is the approach, this is the difference in the approach. Let's briefly talk about some important texts related with this. Stephen Greenblatt, he is the key figure and Will in the World, How Shakespeare Becomes Shakespeare, first book. Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare, second. The Swerve, How the World Become Modern, Learning to Curse, Essays in Modern Culture, and Marvelous Positions, The Wonder of the New World. These are some books written by Stephen Greenblatt, which all deal with his readings, his radical readings of the literary text. Then we have Catherine Belsay's The Subject of Tragedy, Identity and Difference in Renaissance Drama. Then Shakespeare and the Last of Eden, The Construction of Family Value in Early Modern Culture. And last, Catherine Gallagher and Greenblatt, their famous book Practicing New Historicism. Okay friends, this was all about new historicism. I hope I was able to make it clear to you people, and this was an honest attempt to simplify this particular approach. Very soon we will come with another video on another literary theory approach. Till then, keep supporting this channel. It is your own channel. Keep putting queries and encourage me like you always do. Thank you friends.